We made it. We've got to the DNG part where we start to look at remote desktop protocol and how we can protect RDP servers. Now, this particular section where we start talking about RDP and how the DNG can protect RDP sessions without the need for a VPN will be broken up into multiple sections. And the reason I'm doing this is because I want to go through this presentation that I've put together. It will really delve a little bit further into the Duo network gateway, what's required for the protection of RDP servers, and a breakdown of DNS. And I've put there, a brief review, and I've tried to keep it as brief as possible while making it as easy as possible to understand the sort of different types of records that are required when we're working with the DNG. And I've done this because I've had multiple customers that look at the requirements for the DNG and don't always understand why the different records are required in order to use certain features such as RDP, and if you are looking at protecting web applications and SSH. So I really wanted to just delve a little bit further into that. So this session is really going to be focused on and around this presentation, and then in the next video we'll get into the actual configuration aspect of the DNG and protecting RDP servers. Now, just before I get into this presentation, the Duo documentation does have a lot of information around the requirements for the DNG, but the main aim here is to kind of break that down a little bit further and maybe just refresh or give an overview into DNS and sort of the requirements and where they fit in with the DNG. So we'll start off with a brief overview of DNS, and we're going to look at 3 particular records that are required when working with the DNG. Now, only 2 are required if you're not using RDP, but because we're focusing now on RDP, all 3 records are relevant. So we're looking at the A record, the NS record, and the CNAME. So I'll give you some information here as to what each record is, and we'll just quickly run through these. And as I say, all 3 records are required when we're working with the DNG and protecting RDP. If we're just working with web applications and SSH, then we can get away with the use of the A record and CNAMEs. So when we look at DNS and we look at the different types of records that are required for the use of the DNG, we've got these 3 records. So we've got the first one, which is an A record, which is short for address. That's the A record is abbreviated for address. And what this does is it maps the FQDN, so the fully qualified domain name, to an IPv4 address. So we'll see a little bit more of what that actually means as we go through the presentation. But that's essentially the job of an A record. It maps a fully qualified domain name to an IPv4 address. So in the case of the DNG, where does this fit in? Well, this is the name. This A record is going to be the name of the DNG, and this is going to tell anybody that's looking to reach your DNG from the internet where your DNG is located with an IPv4, a public IPv4 address. Next we have name server. So name server, as I say, is a requirement if we're looking at protecting RDP, and in the following sessions from now this is what we're going to be looking at, so it's very much a requirement from this point forth. So NS record is the abbreviation for name server or name server record. And this basically specifies which name servers are authoritative for the domain or subdomains. Now, when we say a name server is authoritative, basically what this means is it's going to be a name server that is hosting DNS records for your particular domain or subdomain. Now, when we talk about NS records, I've put here that delegation is fundamentally the most important use for an NS record, and this allows us to delegate part of a domain to other DNS servers. So we're basically delegating some of the domain, saying, look at this name server for DNS records, essentially. And I'm not going to dive too much into that because that's a whole different lesson around DNS. But that's a basic overview. So in the case of the DNG, the NS record is used for the subdomain delegation. So the record created will point to the DNG, where there is a correspondence between your external and internal domain. And again, we'll look at that in a little bit more detail as we go through the presentation. Lastly, we have CNAME, or canonical name. And this is essentially an alias. That's all it is, nothing more. And it points to another domain or subdomain. So in the case of the DNG, this is going to be used as a relay between the external and internal network and as an authentication point against the application that's being protected. So again, we will take a little bit more of a look at kind of what that means as we kind of get into it in a little bit more detail. So DNG DNS record types for RDP, there's 3 of them, as we spoke about, and this is just another presentation slide which is just kind of giving you a very, very brief overview of kind of what each one is. So we've pretty much covered that in the first one, so we won't go over it. Now I've put this together because sometimes visually seeing something makes it a lot easier to understand. So I wanted to break it down a little bit further for you when we're looking at these different record types. So I've got a little key there on the right, and I've got the different records there. So you can see at the top we have the A record. So in the case of this demonstration, where my external domain or my public domain is networkwizkid.co.uk, I am going to create an A record, or I already have, and you've seen in the previous videos, I've created an A record that is that has a name of portal, and that maps to the public facing IP address of my DNG. So in all, my A record becomes portal.networkwizkid.co.uk, and that resolves to a public IP address, which is my DNG. We then have the CNAME record, as we spoke about, and all this does when we're referring to the DNG is when we have the CNAME configured, the alias configured, all this is going to do is map back to the A record. So it's going to map back to our DNG essentially. So you can see there we have an example. The CNAME record here in this case would have an alias of RDP relay, and then the full name of that CNAME would be rdprelay.networkwizkid.co.uk. And again, that alias is going to map back to the A record. So when that alias is queried, it's basically going to again map back to the A record. Lastly, we have the NS record, which we spoke about, and it being used for the subdomain and the domain mapping between external and internal, and this is used for RDP. And again, this NS record is going to map back, in the case of the the DNG, it's going to map back to, again, the A record as well. So when we create an NS record, in this case, external, that external.networkwizkid.co.uk, when queried, is going to map back, or it's going to point to, it's going to say, yes, go to the A record, essentially. So I've put together another slide which is really building on the Duo documentation that we have around the DNG at the moment. And again, I've kind of color coded it because we all like colors, and I think it makes a little bit more sense sometimes when it's kind of color coded like this, so you can see kind of which parts map to which. So in this example, we have the internal domain, which is internal.com. And then we have the public domain, which is external.com. So again, when we look at the DNG and the DNG documentation, where we have a similar table like the one that I'm showing now, the only thing that I've changed here is the domain, well, both of the domains, and I put in this last table here to give examples to kind of really in an effort to help it make a little bit more sense. So again, these are the different record types. So again, let's say we're creating the DNS record type A for our DNG. Our DNG public interface is going to be located at the IP address here, so 1111.211.222.42, and the name of this record is going to be portal. And because this is assigned to, we're creating these records on our public domain, this is going to be for external.com. So let's just leave all the TTLs. We don't need to focus on them for this particular video. So we create this DNS-A record with a name of portal, and that's going to then become portal.external.com in this instance, as you can see there. So we've got red, which is going to be the A record, and then we've got orange, which is mapping to the public domain, because that's where we've created it. And again, this fully qualified domain is going to point to the public IP address of the DNG. We then move on to the CNAME, which again is an alias. And an example here is when we create the CNAME, let's say we created a CNAME with a name RDP-relay, and the value of that alias would point back to the A record, as I mentioned previously. So the value would be portal.external.com. So that then becomes, when we've created this alias, it becomes rdp-relay.external.com, which is an alias for, in fact, the A record, portal.external.com. A CNAME is used to access protected web applications and SSH servers, but the user will use the NS record for RDP access. So as I mentioned before, if we're just concentrating on web applications and NS and SSH, then we're going to use CNAMEs. And if we're focused on RDP, then we're not going to use the CNAME. We don't need to. The CNAME is used, and that's why it's required. But as an end user accessing an RDP session, we don't need to be concerned with the CNAME in this case for RDP. This is where the NS record comes in. So let's say we create now an NS record that's required for us to successfully configure RDP. So we create an NS record with a name RDP, And again, the value of that name is going to map back to the A record, so portal.external.com. So I've put here that users that want to access an RDP host on internal.com with a host name of RDP host. So let's say, for instance, you want to protect access to RDP host, which is inside your network, internal.com. That would typically have an FQDN of rdphost.internal.com. Now, because you want to protect this with the DNG, we need to have an alias created, as we mentioned previously. So this is going to be protected in this case, in this example. This rdphost.internal.com is going to be protected by the CNAME, or the alias rdp-relay.external.com, which is a CNAME, sorry, up here. And therefore, users connect using the host name of the machine followed by the NS record. So the way it works is that you're taking the host name from the internal RDP client in this case, and you're using the NS record, which is rdp.external.com, to connect to the RDP host. And what this essentially subdomain mapping is going to do, it's going to map the and we'll see this in as we configure the RDP stuff on the DNG. It's going to map this to your internal.com in order to kind of form or bind that connection. So I hope that makes a little bit more sense now for those that maybe was struggling a little bit to kind of understand the correlation between each of the different DNS records. I also put together, and I hope this is a little bit better to view. I showed this in one of the presentations that I did at the start of this DNG series, I believe, but I think it were maybe a little bit too small. So hopefully it's a little bit bigger now, but it's just because I've kind of designed it where I've packed everything I could onto kind of one image. And this is just kind of getting down to the nitty-gritty in terms of an RDP flow with the DNG, just to kind of help just put it into practice a little bit more. So we've kind of discussed the theory around it. We discussed the DNS and how the DNG uses DNS, and give you a few examples there. And this really just is a infograph that I put together, which is an understanding of kind of how an RDP flow actually works. So most of it you don't need to worry about unless you like to understand all the every aspect of it. But essentially, you know, we've got top to bottom here a typical remote worker that's looking to access an RDP session that's situated and protected by the DNG. So what first happens is that the remote worker initiates a remote desktop connection to bob.external.networkwizkid.co.uk. So Bob is the internal PC, as you can see on the let's see if I can annotate this. So this is Bob. This is the internal system here. And you can see at the top here, it's got a host name of bob.networkwizkid.com. So that's the internal domain. So networkwizkid.com is the internal domain, and networkwizkid.co.uk is the external domain, or the public domain. And so what we're doing here in step one is we're essentially taking the first portion of the host, which is Bob, and then I'll just color code that. This is what we're talking about here. We're first taking the Bob, and then what we're doing is then we're attaching that NS record, which is that external, in this case, .networkwizkid.co.uk, onto that. And then what happens there is in step 2, the NS record for the subdomain external.networkwizkid.co.uk points to the public IP address, because remember, the NS record just points back. It says go and look at the A record, which in this case, and in the case of the DNG, is going to be the DNG's public facing address. So this then points to the public IP address of the DNG, which in this case is going to be Duo DNG.networkwizkid.co.uk. And by the way, these are slightly different to the examples I gave on the last slides, because this is a diagram that I did some time ago, but the principle still applies. What happens then is the DNG, which is here, so that's our DNG. The DNG checks to see if a valid relay, so this is where we start to look at the relays. So the DNG checks to see if there's any valid relay that exists and performs the internal DNS lookup for bob.networkwizkid.com. So it's kind of doing that kind of that mapping, if you like, as well. Step 4 is, you don't really need to be getting into the details of this, but essentially what happens then is once it's done that lookup, the DNG assigns a random IP address, basically, that is in the carrier grade NAT space for the requested host, and sends back the IP address and TTL for the host name as a DNS-A record. So once that's done on the remote worker's side, the remote worker attempts to establish the RDP connection to the provided IP address that's been given, which is then routed to the Duo Connect tunnel, or the DC TUN. So essentially, and we'll kind of touch on the prerequisites shortly, but on the remote workers side, you need to ensure that you have the Duo Connect and Health app installed in order to get this working with RDP. And again, we'll look at that obviously when we start to configure, and we'll look at that in a few slides. So what happens is then, based on the IP address, as I said, that's been provided, that remote worker here tries to establish that connection with the RDP host, and this arrow is just essentially saying that the flow is it doesn't leave the machine, because we've got that application on the machine, which then in 5.1 the Duo Connect tunnel queries the Duo TCP proxy, which then contacts the DNG to start the authentication process. So that happens, basically with the application on the machine. Duo then, the DNG rather, then redirects the user to the Duo cloud to complete the two-factor authentication via single sign-on. So that's what that does there. And then in step 7, the remote worker enters the SSO primary authentication credentials, which are then checked against the configured IDP. So in our case, in this video series where we configured single sign-on with an on-premise Active Directory, this is essentially what's going to happen here. So our single sign-on, which is Duo SSO, we're going to log in with our primary credentials, which are then checked against our on-premise Active Directory. If the primary authentication of the credentials are valid, then the user is asked to complete two-factor authentication. So in this example, this is where the user is then sent a push notification to their enrolled device. And then once the user confirms that that is a legitimate request and accepts that request, the remote worker approves that request, which is then sent back. And then once that's successfully completed, the Duo Cloud will notify the DNG of the successful secondary factor authentication. And then once that's done, the remote worker is then permitted at the end to connect to bob.networkwizkid.com. And that's it. That's essentially how it works. Hopefully now with that knowledge of the DNS and how that works with the DNG, and going through this RDP flow, hopefully that makes a lot more sense to you. Now when we start looking at the DNG and where these where we kind of map these records, we're essentially when we first configure the DNG, which we did in a few videos past, which you can go back and watch if you haven't already, we give the DNG a fully qualified domain name at the very start. And you can see in this example here, the A record is essentially located in the settings of the DNG, and we can see it there highlighted. Now looking at the aliases, when we're particularly referring to remote desktop relay and protecting RDP, we typically add the CNAME in when we add an RDP relay. So where that's highlighted there, this is typically where we would add that CNAME that we've added to the public record. And then subdomains, so this is where we're looking at the NS record. This is going to be added under a separate section, so not within the application and not within settings. It's going to be added within subdomains, and this is where we spoke about that external to internal mapping, or as Duo calls it, configuring the external to internal subdomain translation. So that's added under subdomains. Now when we look at prerequisites, again, Duo documentation goes into some more detail with some of these, so do check out the Duo documentation as well around the DNG. But we need to ensure that we have the DNG installed with the initial configuration done. So the DNG, in order to run RDP, needs to be either version 2.0.0 or higher in order to run RDP. We need to make sure that the DNS records that we've just spoke about, so the A records, CNAME and the NS records, are in place on your public DNS. And also, if you have not given your internal host that you want to protect and access an internal DNS record, then it's highly recommended that you create that. Firewall rules are in place. So again, the Duo documentation touches on some of these, and I think I've got a slide coming up that kind of just delves a little bit deeper into these as well. So it's very important that you have all the firewall rules in place that are required to ensure that your installation and testing and rollout goes as smooth as possible. And lastly, certificate requirements, make sure that they're all in place as well. Summary of configurations, very straightforward. I think I missed a step. There we go. So there's the firewall rules that I was talking about. So we have, just quickly running through these, let me just highlight these. Quickly running through these, we have, we need to make sure that we've got HTTP and HTTPS on 80 and port 443 allowed bidirectionally on your firewall. So I've put here, typically DNGs are deployed in DMZs, so you need to allow that flow between the DMZ and your external or the internet bidirectional as well, not just DMZ to out. You need to allow that bidirectional as well. Also with DNS, and I've seen a few customers miss this sometimes, typically, obviously with DNS, we're normally allowing DNS over UDP on port 53. However, with the RDP configuration, we need to make sure that bidirectionally we allow DNS on TCP and UDP as well. Then we've got some unidirectional flows that I have put down here. So port 8443 on HTTPS TCP, that's to connect to your DNG, as you'll probably already be connected if you've got this far and you're configuring it anyway. But you need to make sure that you've got access to that in order to access your DNG and manage that. Also, you need to make sure your DNG can access the RDP servers that you want to protect and access remotely. So make sure that you have rules in place to allow for the DNG to connect to those RDP hosts on default 3389 TCP. Similarly with SSH, we need to ensure that the DNG can connect to your SSH servers that you're looking at protecting as well. So you need to make sure that firewall rules are open for that if they're not already. And then also for web applications, ensure that you've got the relevant port open. Obviously, I've put down here default for 18443 again. I've also put a little disclaimer there that other rules may be required depending on whether you're using custom ports or not. So do take that into consideration. Don't take this table as the only rules that are required, because you may need different ones or more in your environment. So just make sure that you assess your environment and plan accordingly. Then summary of the configurations. So again, this is a summary because we have the DNG documentation to go through. But essentially what we're going to do is we're going to protect an RDP server using the Duo admin panel and applications on there. And then we're going to configure the DNG for RDP with some of the settings that we've got from the application that we're protecting. And then we're going to configure the subdomain that we spoke about on the DNG. Then we're going to download and configure the Duo Connect and Duo Device Health onto the remote client that is going to be used to access the internal RDP server. And then lastly, we'll test that connectivity to the RDP server. I've included some links here around the Duo documentation, a little bit more about DNS as well. So I will share this presentation on my website once the series is finished as well for future reference. But that's it in terms of looking into DNS a little bit more and the remote desktop protocol and how the DNG can protect this. So without further ado, I think it's time to get into actually configuring this.